Gun violence? Really? You want to talk about gun violence? Well, let me dispel the whole notion of gun violence. There's no such thing. Gun violence doesn't exist. Gun violence is a nomenclature that was created by the anti-gunners for the purpose of their anti-gun agenda. But the truth is, there's no such thing. Let me give you an example. In London recently, there was a report that showed homicides had exceeded those of New York City. But guess what? They didn't use guns. They used knives. So how does that support the gun violence narrative? It doesn't. It completely blows it up. So sometimes when I say gun violence doesn't exist, people go, what? What do you mean gun? Well, there you go. It just doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. There is, however, human violence. And if we were to focus on human violence, we might be able to get to the point where we could solve some of the violence in our country. But until the anti-gunners are able to recognize this as a human violence thing, the argument is going to continue on forever. And the reason it's so frustrating for them, for the anti-gunners, the reason they can't seem to get anywhere with this so-called gun violence thing is because they're focused on something that doesn't exist. There's no such thing as gun violence. Well, I always get the question, what should we do about these assault weapons? And, the truth is the people who are talking about banning assault weapons don't know the first thing about guns anyway. They don't know what an assault weapon is. And I'll ask them, I'll say, what is an assault weapon? And they don't have an answer. You see, the term assault weapon really wasn't used in the public forum until the 90s, when anti-gun politicians started bringing it into the conversation, start using it all the time for the purpose of demonizing guns and scaring people. So sometimes they'll say, well, it's a semi-automatic, well, it's an automatic, it's got a scope, or it's got an extended magazine, or a pistol grip, or any number of different things. So I'll often ask them, because there's so many definitions of this so-called assault weapon, would you be able to give me your specific definition and define assault weapon so I know what we're talking about? And they can't. So if the anti-gunners really want to work on the real problem, which is human violence, they'll focus on the things that cause people to be violent. And they can look at different areas of the country, and you can look at the areas where violence is most prevalent in this country. And there are 4 cities that are very violent, and they're Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, among others. But those 4 in particular are Democrat-run and very heavily gun-restricted. So what does this tell you about gun restrictions and how they affect violence? When you take away the ability of people to protect themselves, the bad guys swarm in because they know there's no opposition. This isn't rocket science. So you wonder, well, don't they understand this? Don't the lawmakers understand what's happening and what they're doing when they restrict good people? The question really is, of course they understand what they're doing. The question is why? What are they getting out of it? Gun restrictions cause more deaths. And the CDC put out a report. Actually, they just put out this report that had been shelved since the 90s. And they finally released it. And what it showed was that guns were used to save lives 2.46 million times on average per year. But the anti-gunners don't want you to hear this statistic because it doesn't, it doesn't fit their narrative. But the truth is, guns save lives more than they are used to take them. Where you have more concealed carry, you have less crime because you're building an opposition for the bad guys. When you take that opposition away, the bad guys go crazy. In order to support gun restrictions, you need to believe at least one of two things. Number one, that we could get all the guns out of the country. Now, in the United States, we have anywhere from 300 million to 600 million guns. Getting rid of guns is impossible. It'll never happen. But some of them believe that they can. Some of the anti-gunners believe that that's possible. The other thing that you have to believe is that with gun restrictions, the bad guys will stop doing bad things. And so in order to believe one or the other or both of these things, if you're a logical thinking person, you just can't do it. So people are programmed and people are convinced through repetitive propaganda and a consistent diet of anti-gun rhetoric and anger and fear. Well, one of the very interesting and sinister scenarios that anti-gunners will use is called the toddler in the gun scenario. This is where the anti-gun media or politicians want you to believe that all across this country, cute little diaper-bottom babies are dying because they're getting a hold of their parents' guns that their parents just irresponsibly left, loaded, just laying around the house. The number of child gun-related deaths is tiny. It's minuscule, but people like Hillary Clinton love to use this scenario, the toddler and the gun, because it pulls at the heartstrings. The truth is, children are much more likely to die and drown in their backyard swimming pool than they are from gun-related deaths. But that doesn't stop the anti-gun warriors. They love to use these scary scenarios because it makes people scared, it makes people angry. What it does is it puts fear in the hearts of people, makes them scared of guns, and it also creates a hatred and anger toward gun owners, which is the other side of the coin. I mean, these two things, fear and hate, are a great motivator for the anti-gun side. This is how they keep their base active and fierce. What I've noticed is that people in this country are starting to get the definitions of rights and privileges mixed up. They don't seem to understand that a privilege is something that's given. A privilege can be taken away. A right is not. A right is inherent, and specifically with our Second Amendment right, it's something that cannot be taken away. But what's happening is people in our country are being trained and conditioned to view rights as privileges. This is why they can say things like, well, I support your Second Amendment right, but I think we need common sense gun restrictions. Well, you can't support my right to keep and bear arms while restricting my right to keep and bear arms, but they think that that's okay because they don't see the difference. If you want to see the perfect example of indoctrination or brainwashing, look no further than the anti-gun radical. These people have taken the hook, line, bait, sinker, the fishing pole, and now they're trying to eat the boat. They have been fed a consistent diet of fearful propaganda, and they have embraced the anti-gun narrative and the anti-gun ideology. It's almost like a team sport. You cheer your team on, and your team can do no bad. You're watching the Super Bowl, and I don't care how bad your team is losing, how bad their plays are, how horrible they're performing. You stick with your team. Well, the anti-gunners have found their team, and regardless of the facts, regardless of truth, regardless of safety, real safety of people, they don't care. They will use any lies, any propaganda, any information that they can to push their anti-gun narrative. And the thing is, I think Americans are starting to recognize the illogic that comes from the anti-gun side of the conversation. And patriots are starting to stand up. One of the things that I talk about a lot is terminology, anti-gun terminology. Things like assault weapon, gun violence, Wild West. These are terms that the anti-gunners use to demonize guns and gun owners. And it's effective because what happens is we start to use those terms in society. And what I do is I'll break those terms down and help people try to understand, try to get a grasp on the effectiveness of their terminology and how to understand when they're inserting it into the conversation, because most of the time a lot of this stuff just goes unnoticed, but it does have a psychological impact on people, and it does change the way people think about guns. And if you change the way people think about a topic, you change their beliefs about a topic. Whether it's true or not, whether it's factual or not, it doesn't matter. You can program people to think certain things, and terminology is one of the tools they use, and they know how to use it well. So understanding that much and recognizing when the terminology is used, it helps people understand when they're being manipulated, when they're being misled. Of course the anti-gunners need someone to fight. They need a bad guy. They really do believe that they're the good guys. And to think that anyone would try to undermine the rights of their fellow citizens is just crazy. But here's the thing: groups like the NRA, Gun Owners of America, these groups and others like them are fighting to preserve our rights. And the idea that anti-gunners would go and attack groups like the NRA is astonishing. But when you think about it, they do need a boogeyman, and they choose the most honorable and the most dedicated and the most patriotic groups in our country to fight against. So what does that tell you about the anti-gun left?